Thanks for the introduction, Yanni. Welcome to this session today. It's been a great session so far, and we've had some great talks from Professor Cliff Mallett, as well as Professor Damien Farrow. So I always enjoy Damien's talks, and in fact, he's set up his talks have really set the stage up for what I'm going to be talking about today. And as you can notice, it's not a mistake in there. I got asked by the IT people whether the draft in bracket was a mistake, but it's not. In fact, this is still a work in progress, and it started, the idea sort of started roughly about a year ago at the last YCC when we held some workshops with the coaches. And the coaches had a lot of questions about further questions on how to put skill acquisition principles into practice. And so we got talking about perhaps developing a skill acquisition framework for youth coaches in Singapore, as has been done overseas in New Zealand and in Australia as well. So without further ado, I'll jump straight into the presentation. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the skill acquisition working group members. So that includes Associate Professor Jai Chow, Dr. Jonathan, who's in the room today and will also be joining the panel discussion later, as well as Professor Rich Masters, who was instrumental in the development of the New Zealand skill acquisition framework. So I'd like to thank all the members of the working group who've put in a lot of effort to get us to where we are here, and it's still, as I mentioned, a work in progress. I'd also like to acknowledge all the feedback that we've got so far from the coaches, so thank you so much, because we very much think that the framework needs to be developed along with the input from the various youth coaches within the Singapore framework in order to make it more applied to our context over here. So thanks to everyone that's been involved in this so far. So today, roughly what I'll be talking about is the process that we've gone through to get to where we are, some of the objectives of what the skill acquisition framework would like to achieve, as well as present to you the draft of the actual framework as well. So what was the process? As I mentioned, roughly around the time of the last YCC, we got talking and we formulated a working group. And one of the first things that the working group brought up was to say, well, before we start developing a skill acquisition framework for Singapore, what we need to understand is what is the sentiment on the ground. So what are the current coaching beliefs and practices that coaches actually undertake in Singapore before we can actually go on to develop this framework. So there were a few interesting things that came out of that questionnaire. So in the interest of time, I won't go too deeply into that, but it was definitely informative in all the discussions that took place since then. The working group has had many long discussions, and it's been really, really thought-provoking. And we've been through a few iterations to give in to where we've come today. In fact, the first version looked quite different from what I'm going to present to you today, not content-wise, maybe slightly on the visual end as well. And finally, we were lucky enough to have a small group of coaches from Singapore come in and give us some feedback about this draft. And this was just in the end of February, so their input has not yet been incorporated into the framework, but we do hope to do so in the next few months and have an even better version of the framework out, hopefully by the end of the year. So that's the process. Now, before we present the framework, I think the team was really wanted to establish what the framework is. So what is really the objective? And so first I'll go through what the framework is, and also quite importantly, what it is not achieving or what it's not aspiring to achieve. So the first thing that the framework is, it's an evidence-based guiding resource for coaches. So it's very much got a very strong evidence base, and so we lean upon a lot of the theories such as ecological dynamics and the theory of reinvestment. And there's a lot of research, as Damien presented some of it as well, that has backed these practices that we, or these concepts that we introduce in the model. And also it's a guiding resource in the sense that it doesn't have the answers to all your questions, but it can definitely guide you while you're looking for the answers to those questions. Secondly, the framework was created really to allow coaches to apply contemporary skill acquisition principles in their daily facilitation, designing, planning, and evaluation of each of their training sessions as well. And finally, the framework has definitely been designed with regards to youth coaches in this space. So we want it to have a sustained impact on the professional development of the coaches, but also ensure long-term athlete development, so that we have our youth athletes, or we're building training environments so that our youth athletes stay on and persist in that sporting space for a longer period of time. So just like I've mentioned, that's what the framework is aiming to achieve. But what is the framework not? So I think this is very important also to put out there. So firstly, the framework should always be used as a whole. So it's really important to understand each layer of the framework before going into the next. So really understanding the why before you jump into the how-to in terms of coaching practices. It's also not a silver bullet in the sense that it is not a one-stop shop where you get all the answers to every coaching query, but it's really just a guiding tool in that sense. And finally, we do have to acknowledge that it may challenge some traditional coaching beliefs and practices, and that became evident even in our discussions with the coaches in the focus groups, but to rest assured that all of it is evidence-based, and I mean, the concepts that we're proposing in the framework are really evidence-based. So without further ado, we'll just jump straight into the framework itself. All right, so the framework is really created in a way where we introduce each layer separately, and there are 3 different layers. So the first layer, we asked ourselves, in order to develop desirable characteristics of youth athletes, so we talk about some of these desirable characteristics, what we need to do is the framework will discuss key concepts in skill acquisition, which can contribute to developing these desirable characteristics. And finally, we'll go into the level of how this framework can introduce some key design principles that you can take with you to your everyday training sessions to help you plan, design, and facilitate those sessions. Okay, so we'll go through it layer by layer. So the first layer is talking about what these desirable characteristics of youth athletes are. So what we're looking as coaches when we work with youth athletes to do is not just train specific skills that can be performed well in training settings, but we're also interested in looking at how those skills can actually be transferred into different contexts, such as high pressure contexts. So in that sense, we want athletes that are robust under pressure. So if we go back to what Professor Farrow mentioned as well, I think we look at skills similarly to him in the sense that it's a combination of technique and adaptability, which brings us to the second box in the first layer of wanting to develop athletes that are adaptable. So they're athletes that can carry out they're athletes that can carry out the skills not just in the training context, but in different situations as well. So that might be different environments, maybe indoor or outdoor venues, but it could also be in different contexts, like when they're playing different teams, a stronger team or a weaker team. And if they're trailing or if they're leading, we want them to be able to adapt their skills continually and be able to carry it out in these dynamic environments. And finally, I think one of the most important characteristics that we're looking to develop in youth athletes is for them to be motivated. And what we mean by this is we want athletes to be motivated in the training scenarios, and we also want them to be motivated in the competition context. So when they do face challenges, for instance, they're not overwhelmed by these challenges, and they don't feel like they don't want to approach the task, but we also don't want them to be at the other end of the continuum, which is extremely unmotivated or, as Damien mentioned again, seeking or feeling boredom in training settings because they're extremely repetitive. So what we're looking to do is really focus on these 3 particular desirable characteristics of youth athletes as they relate to skill acquisition. So now that we know what these desirable youth, what these characteristics of youth athletes are, we can move into the next layer, which is really understanding the why before we go into the how. So what are some of the key concepts that we'd like to introduce here? Okay, so the first one really is that quality of practice is as important as quantity of practice. Now, this might sound familiar to you, especially from Damien's talk earlier as well. So what we mean by this is that performing more repetitions of the same skill, so in other words, quantity, does not automatically result in learning. And so we must ask ourselves, what are the roles of these repetitions? So are we looking to do repetitions in order to just train the movement itself? So do we want athletes that can carry out the same skill over and over again in a predictable manner? Or are we looking to develop athletes that are able to adapt these skills in a variety of contexts? So linking it back to the adaptability and robustness under pressure. Whereas if it is the latter, so if we are looking to develop athletes that are adaptable and robust under pressure, then we need to structure our repetitions in such a way that the athletes engage more in the task. So they're not simply performing the repetitions over and over again without thinking, but they're actually getting more involved in the planning stage of that movement, and they're also evaluating every time they perform the repetition. So really just getting them more engaged in that learning process. Because if you give your athlete, say, a task to do 100 lob shots, by the end of the 100th lob shot, they probably start looking like they're performing quite well. But the question you need to ask yourself is it just that they're performing well, or are they truly learning? Which brings us to the second key concept, is that learning is different from performance. And what do we mean by that? So learning actually refers to a relatively permanent changes in thinking and behavior, whereas performance is actually a temporary fluctuation in thinking and or behavior. So coming back to that example of 100 lob shots, you might see your athlete is performing well, but are they truly learning? Because if you want to see if they've learned the lob shot, then you might need to look at a number of different indicators to assess whether learning has occurred. And some of these indicators are that the performance is consistent, it's persistent over time, so it's not just within a session or within that month, but you also have to look at it continually at different periods of time, and also to look at how adaptable that skill is if you put the athlete in a different context or in a game context or a pressure context. How are they able to adapt that skill? Because if they're able to carry out that lob shot in a match, in a competitive setting or in a game situation, then we can be rest assured that that skill has been learned. So just simply by looking at the number of different indicators that we need to use in order to assess learning, well, that tells us learning is quite complex, which brings us to our next concept, which is that learning is complex. So as humans, we're complex systems, and hence the learning process itself is also quite complex. So there are a number of different interacting factors that go into the process of learning. And so the changes can be unpredictable. So as coaches, it is to be quite patient in that process of learning, not expecting changes or not expecting all athletes to go from point A to point B to point C in a predictable manner in a set given time frame, for instance. But each athlete might have a slightly different journey or a slightly non-linear path in that learning journey. So that brings us to the next one, which is individuals can achieve the same goal using a variety of different solutions through exploration. So whenever I think of this, what comes to mind to me is the Sri Lankan bowler called Lasith Malinga. And if you ever watch him, and you can YouTube him if you don't watch cricket, you'll see his action is quite odd because he actually swings the ball in a very strange manner. And in fact, because of that, he's gotten famous and he's got the name Malinga the Slinger. Now, if I was as a coach seeing him for the first time bowling in that manner, I might actually look at him and say, well, that doesn't look right, so I must jump in and correct him. But if I did that as his coach, I perhaps he wouldn't be where he was, because it was because of that odd motion that batsmen didn't know where the ball was going, and that led to his international success. So as coaches, if we're willing to allow a certain level of exploration within our athletes, then we have to be comfortable with this idea of making errors. Which brings us to our next key concept, that errors play a role in learning and performance. So error detection and correction are an important part of that learning process, as it encourages independent learning. So what we're saying here is not for coaches to jump in and correct the errors immediately, but in fact to allow your athletes to make those errors and feel comfortable in that space making the errors while they explore and learn how to move and how to adapt that movement. Now, this was definitely one that created some very interesting discussion when we brought it to the focus group, because there is a certain level of hesitancy when we talk about errors. So what we're saying over here is simply not saying that errors are good or errors are bad, but rather as a coach asking you, who knows your athlete best, to decide what your tolerance for error is based on your athlete. So in a way, to calibrate your tolerance for errors depending on the athlete you're working with and your knowledge of that athlete as well. And so for skilled athletes, for instance, as Damien mentioned as well, you might actually introduce what we call differential learning. So you might actually introduce errors, because for very skilled athletes, they probably don't make errors as often in a natural environment, but we could introduce errors into their performance, again, in order to increase their adaptability of the skill. So just like we said, it's not as a coach to jump in immediately as you see an error to go and correct it because that's your job, but maybe to allow that exploration, which brings us to the fifth key concept, which is information constraints can be non-prescriptive. And what do we mean by information constraints? So here we're specifically speaking about instructions and feedback. And so as coaches, we need to think a bit more about how much feedback, how much verbal feedback, how much verbal instructions we're actually giving our athletes and how that's impacting the learning process. Because if we want independent learners, then perhaps we should step back a bit and try and use more contemporary approaches like implicit learning, for instance, or even looking at external focus of attention and some other strategies which reduce the sort of guidance in this learning journey as well. Okay, so those were our five key concepts that we think of skill acquisition that need to be understood before, so that we can develop athletes that have the desirable characteristics that we talk about in the blue ring. So the next thing we'll talk about is really the key design principles, or the innermost circle, really the how you would go about designing or what you would consider when you first go into designing and facilitating your training sessions. So we have used the constraints model here to guide us along that path. So essentially, as a coach, what you're required to do is think of three elements. Okay, so it's the athlete, the task, and the environment. So these are the three main constraints or elements that you need to think about when you go into each training session. We believe that the athlete should definitely be central to the design of the training sessions. And I think this has been made clear even in Professor Mallett's talk earlier about how important it is to consider the individual that you're working with and where they might be, not only in terms of their capabilities, so whether they're a beginner or whether they're a skilled athlete, but also in terms of their psychological aspects. How is your athlete feeling on a given day? Or how motivated is your athlete? So that's something definitely to think about. The psychological aspects, the physiological aspects, and the actual capability of the athlete should definitely be central to before you ever go in to a training session with a plan. And secondly, we'll talk about some of the task constraints. So as a coach, you would definitely be playing around with this feature the most. So it's things like the rules of the game or the goal of the task, and it even includes things like the amount of instructions and feedback you give your athletes. Because that eventually does influence the way the athlete learns. If you give a lot of instructions constantly, for instance, to your athlete, then they might become reliant on that and they might be less of an independent learner. And finally, we'll talk about the environment as well. So that's an aspect that may not always be easy to manipulate because it includes things like the lights, the sounds, the surface that your athletes are playing on. Is it a hard court? Is it grass? Is it AstroTurf? But to always include these elements, because again, as Damien mentioned earlier with the diving example and the diving research that they've done, if I'm going to dive into a pit, a foam pit, I'm going to dive in feet first, whereas if I'm diving into a body of water, I'm going to dive head first. And then that influences the biomechanics of how I approach the task. So to always ask yourself, what environment are you conducting the task in, and how representative is that of your performance context? So as important as it is to individually account or think about each of these elements, it's also really important to look at the interaction between these elements. So the task constraints should always be matched to the athlete's skill level to encourage exploration and adaptability. So I'll get to this in a second. And the other interaction that you should think about as well is the interaction between the athlete and the environment. So I'll very briefly go into each of these interactions, and I think Damien has made it quite easy for me because he gave you plenty of information on some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about as well. So the very first thing going into a training session you'd always ask yourself is, what is the session objective? Or what is it that you're trying to achieve in that given session? And if it is dribbling a soccer ball accurately, if that's really your session objective, then you could look at a few of these constraints and think of how you might be able to manipulate them in order to bring about that learning. So for instance, if you look at the task constraints, you might look at how many defenders that you want in that particular session, so that your athletes learn to dribble around defenders. Or you might ask yourself, where are the matches usually played? Because if they're played on AstroTurf, for instance, you might actually, your athletes might move faster or dribble faster if they're on AstroTurf. So maybe you want to try and make your training context within that environment as well. And so an example here is dribbling in soccer with defenders on AstroTurf. So this is really simplifying and breaking down those interactions between different concepts. You could also ask yourself some of these questions just to guide you along the way. So is the environment adequately represented in the task? And if we look at the other way around, does the task include variability of the performance environment? So just some simple questions to guide you along how those different features interact. So now let's look at the task and athlete interaction. So if you're going in with the same session objective, so I want my athletes to be able to dribble a soccer ball, I might look at the skill level of my athletes, because as Damien mentioned earlier, we want to find that optimal challenge point. So if I'm working with a beginner, I might look at maybe having 2 defenders on there, so they learn how to maneuver the ball while also looking out for the defenders. But if I'm working with more skilled athletes, I might have more defenders, or I might even go a step further and have defenders that have really good deceptive moves. So that's really increasing that challenge point depending on the level of your athlete, and constantly looking at that interaction. So not setting up tasks that look exactly the same across different skill levels. Because really what we're trying to achieve, as Damien mentioned as well, is we're trying to change that level or move that cursor around the task difficulty so that it's not too low where you know, tedium or you're underloading the athlete might happen, but you don't want it so high as well where you're overloading your athlete where they're not able to take on that information. So that's something to think about in terms of the interaction. To ask yourself, is the task appropriately challenging my athlete? And is my athlete experiencing variation in the learning process? And finally, we'll come to the third interaction, which is between the environment and the athlete. So if my session objective for today is really to get my athletes to play a game amongst distractions, then what I might do over there is I might actually have a small-sided game and I might create some noise in the environment to act as a distraction for my athletes. But I may not do that if we think about the skill level with some of my beginner athletes who are already quite overloaded by just performing the task themselves. So it's really, again, about finding that challenge point, but very importantly as well is about finding your training sessions that are more representative of your performance context. So if I use Damien's words in that sense, is including that task specificity at all times when you're looking at training sessions. So we're not saying we want every training session to be a sort of full game situation under stress, but what we're saying is what are the relevant elements given your session objective, and how can we incorporate those into training in order to bring about the most effective form of learning. So yeah, that was a very brief intro into the skill acquisition framework, or at least a draft of it. And as we mentioned, the next time you look at it, it might look slightly different in terms of the visuals, but in terms of the content where, as you would say, we're not reinventing the wheel here. You would have seen the optimal challenge point. You would have heard of the specificity. We're using the same language wherever we are, whether we're sitting in Australia or in New Zealand, as Rich is. We're all sort of using the same language in order to really drive how we apply skill acquisition into practice. All right. And thank you so much. I'm not sure if there's time for questions, but maybe we move that into the panel discussion in that sense. Yeah. Thank you.